One of the key issues in moral psychology is cultural variations in ethical foundations and principles. The best developed leading attempt to study these cultural variations is the moral foundations theory due to Graham, Hyde and their colleagues. So let's take a moment to return to moral foundations theory and see how well their theory has stood up against the discoveries that we have been considering in this course, and also whether we can relate that moral foundations theory to our recently considered dual process theory of ethical judgments. So here in essence is moral foundations theory, comprising these four claims. The first is the claim that there is a first draft of the moral mind, which Graham and his colleagues are explicit is supposed to be a claim about nativism. Now, we've just been looking at nativism earlier in this very lecture, and what I want to suggest here is just that that may be true. That may be true. There's no reason to rule it out, but we also don't have any strong evidence for it, nor is there good reason to think that the premise there is doing a lot of explanatory work. What we really want from the point of view of moral foundations theory is for the foundations themselves to be uniform across the human population, but that could be a consequence of factors other than nativism. So it seems to me that we should probably drop that premise. It's not critical to explanation. Dropping it does little damage to moral foundations theory. We can weaken it. The next idea is that it is cultural learning. The idea is that you start off early in life with some essential moral foundations, perhaps a sense of, things that are pro-social, things that are anti-social, the idea that it's good to punish someone who's anti-social, but good to reward someone who's pro-social, for example. You see where I'm getting that from? And that would get edited during development with the culture, so that as children go older and become more communicative and interact more with people around them, they will learn more about them. And that would explain, I think, why in places where historically there has been a high prevalence of pathogens, there is also, in people who live there, greater emphasis on average on purity as a moral consideration. If that finding is true, the finding about pathogens, then that would be a nice example of cultural learning. So I think this idea about cultural learning remains well supported by the research that we have considered. The third claim is the social intuitionist model, and that's summarised with the slogan "Intuitions come first," but I don't think that's very helpful, so I think it's better to have the model here. You'll notice, if you've been following along with these recordings, that I updated the diagram because I realised the diagram I was using before from a different text actually had arrows the wrong way around, which confused some of us. I apologise for that in the question time. So this is actually the wrong source. The correct diagram is taken from a different source, but it's another Hyde paper. Anyway, the crucial thing here you can see is that the social intuitionist model, this is part of moral foundations theory, this is a one process theory. When you make a judgment, there is one process that informs that judgment, and that is supposed to be the process of intuition. What could be the problem here? Well, one of the problems is that we've seen that this is false. Reflecting on Bandura's theory of moral disengagement, we had good reason to suppose that actually there are ways in which, in mundane circumstances, not just in the sort of abstract philosophical situations that Hyde and colleagues consider, but actually in mundane circumstances, it's likely that many of our ethical judgments are indirectly, perhaps, a consequence of reasoning from principles that we can articulate. So the social intuitionist model is false, and it's false because we know that ethical judgments are sometimes a consequence of reasoning from known principles. It's kind of puzzling that Hyde is one of the proponents of this model, because if you think carefully about moral dumbfounding involves a contrast between a case where reason is playing a role and a case where reason is playing less of a role. So it's actually kind of strange to think that the moral judgments are a consequence of a single intuitive process. Of course, we then have the natural thought here is, well, what we should do is recognise that we have a dual process theory. So we take out the social intuitionist model and we replace that with a dual process theory of judgment, which just says that the moral judgment will be a consequence of two processes. And although one may dominate on one occasion, it may be that we can change the factors around here, the contextual factors such as time pressure or cognitive load, and that may weaken the influence of one process and strengthen the influence of another process. So a natural successor to the social intuitionist model is our dual process theory. Now, we don't know, of course, that the dual process theory is true, but we do know enough, thinking about moral disengagement and dumbfounding, to know that the social intuitionist model is true. So it's reasonable for us to take the dual process theory as a natural successor there. But here's the thing, can we slot that in? Can we just slot that in to moral foundations theory? Well, let's take a look at the question about the moral foundations questionnaire. So if this objection is very important for this issue, if we take the social intuitionist model, the moral foundations questionnaire makes perfect sense, because what it does is it measures unreflective moral judgments. If you remember, you get questions like, how bad would this be? How bad would that be? And so on. And if the social intuitionist model is true, people are answering those questions on the basis of their moral foundations and the cultural learning only. So you're getting a kind of direct view into exactly what you want to tap, the expression of the moral foundations in one or another culture. That's absolutely ideal. Once we reject the social intuitionist model, look what happens. So if we go, for example, with the dual process theory, we think that those unreflective ethical judgments are a consequence of both the fast processes and processes which involve reasoning from known principles. Now, both of those processes can be subject to cultural influences, but also may not be, but also there'll be quite a lot of idiosyncratic influences we would expect, just as in the physical case. It would be quite difficult to find points of uniformity. There should be also quite a lot of individual variation in the way that inexpert people reason about physical properties on the basis of their experience. Same thing, of course, in the case of language or numerical cognition and so on. So if this is right, then the moral foundations questionnaire is providing us with a much more indirect route into the way that moral foundations are expressed within a culture. So it might not be all that surprising that we have encountered some problems in applying that questionnaire, some measurement theoretic problems. That could be a consequence of the fact that the processes which underpin the responses are not quite as Graham, Hyde and colleagues assume that they must be. In any case, my suggestion here is that we have to reject the social intuitionist model, that we might want to replace that, we might be able to replace that with a dual process theory of moral cognition, but that of course will involve changing all of moral foundations. So let's take a look at the last claim here, the pluralism. This is just the idea that there are many psychological foundations of morality, so that it's not all a matter of minimizing harm or fairness or something like maximizing fairness or something like that. It's also the case that things like purity are moral issues, that in-group loyalty, that respect for authority, things and even perhaps libertarian values, respect for property, are moral issues, things that many people in a university like Warwick will be coming from socially liberal backgrounds, and so we'll find somewhat counterintuitive and perhaps even, immoral. Interesting. So the pluralism, I think, is an important contribution. It's important to recognise that different people have different senses of which issues are moral and which are not. Some people have, for example, food taboos that they regard as moral issues. That's part of life. Okay, very good. So what's our suggestion here? I think if we look at all of the discoveries taken together, we should accept only half of the moral foundations theory. The idea about cultural learning seems to stand up quite well so far. The idea of pluralism seems to stand up quite well so far. But we don't need nativism. That's not a well-supported claim, and it's not doing a lot of theoretical work for us. We can take a weaker claim there, which would just be that the moral foundations fast processes are fairly uniform in infants across the world. Who knows if that's true, but that would be a reasonable premise to start from, much weaker. And we shouldn't accept the social intuitionist model because we know that that's false. So now there's a question for you. I'm not going to sort this out for you. This is a bit of a problem for you, really. Can we combine these claims, the cultural learning claim and the pluralism claim, with the dual process theory? It seems to me that doing that would give us two potential benefits. The first benefit is from the point of view of moral foundations theory. If we take this approach, then we can use the methods associated with the dual process theory and apply those to trying to study cultural variation. And if you've been following along this lecture, you've seen an example of that because we've used a study by Luke and Goronsky from this year, 2021, in order to test the hypothesis that there are cultural differences in the extent to which people are accepting the outcomes as the important determiner of right and wrong, how sensitive people are to outcomes. So process dissociation is something that we naturally think of as a method appropriate for testing if we go with a dual process theory, and that process dissociation approach turns out to be useful also for studying cultural variation. So it might be that we can combine that with some of the evidence that's already been gained from Moral Foundation's questionnaire studies and perhaps some other studies in order to get a deeper understanding of cultural variation. So the suggestion of dropping social intuitionist model and going with dual process theory seems to benefit someone who's a fan of moral foundations theory. Basically, it's not moral foundations theory anymore if we take out the key parts, but we've got the really core important thing. We've got pluralism, we've got methods for studying cultural variation. By including the dual process theory, we're trying to broaden the methods that we are using for studying cultural variation, and also to understand why it is that using Moral Foundations questionnaire, although many of the results may indeed turn out to be valuable, is a much more risky proposition than has been widely appreciated by its proponents. But what about from the point of view of a dual process theorist? So suppose that you were quite tempted by the dual process theory of ethical judgment that we have been articulating, that stripped down dual process theory. What you notice is that you're kind of frustrated. Or at least I am, and I hope you share some of this frustration, because a lot of the research on it has been strongly influenced by Green's much more elaborate set of claims, which include, claims about affect, also critically the claim that essentially you're either making characteristically consequentialist or characteristically deontological judgments. Now that idea hasn't really stood up very well to the gathering of evidence. That idea seems to create problems because you can be neither, because when you're reasoning, you can reason yourself just as easily into deontological position as the consequentialist one, perhaps even more easily, and so on. So there's a number of problems with that idea. Bringing in elements of moral foundations theory to the dual process theory and focusing in particular on pluralism might allow us, as proponents of this dual process theory, eventually to develop a series of auxiliary hypotheses which are potentially more interesting and more predictively better at generating predictions than this kind of consequentialist deontologist opposition. Perhaps we should think about predictions in terms of distribution of fairness, but also, whether something is pure and impure and so on. Perhaps we should develop auxiliary hypotheses along those lines. Now, I think we're a long way from being able to do that, but perhaps you can just about see here, if you're squinting at it, how somebody developing a dual process theory might be able to draw on some of these ideas about pluralism and the various moral foundations in constructing a dual process theory. Long story short, I think moral foundations theory doesn't fare very well. It faces a number of theoretical and empirical objections. On the other hand, this is our best, really our only hope for studying cultural variation in ethical abilities in a way that is kind of repeatable. This is the only way to do that, as far as I know anyway. So moral foundations theory is also our best bet. The possibility that awaits us then is that we may be able to fruitfully combine elements of moral foundations theory with our stripped down dual process theory and get the best of both worlds.